Food desert is a term that's used a lot, areas where it's difficult to access healthy food. I used to talk about food deserts a lot too, especially as a white academic trying to help neighboring communities. However, the more I was with and listening to advocates from these communities, the more resistance I heard to labeling their communities as food deserts. And about a year ago, a Black farmer in St. Louis named Tyreen Lewis introduced me to the term food apartheid, which is gaining popularity and better defining the issues that result in unfair food access. And as Karen Washington's quote here suggests, beginning the real conversation. So today we're going to take a closer look at these two terms and the historical and current systems in place perpetuating the inequities that we see. But first, we would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggle for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Our objectives with this institution are to define food insecurity, food desert, food apartheid, and food sovereignty. We will discuss the history and systems in place perpetuating food apartheid and discuss ways to support food sovereignty and justice in Illinois. We'll start by going over a few terms that we'll be using in today's presentation and their relevance. This whole presentation encompasses food insecurity, which is the state of being without reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable and nutritious food. 21% of Black Americans are projected to experience food insecurity in 2021. 1 in 6 Latinx households suffer from food insecurity, and 1 in 10 individuals face food insecurity in Illinois. 1 in 6 children are food insecure in Illinois, and that is a number from 2014, which is probably higher at this time. More than half of households using food pantries have a member with high blood pressure, and 66% choose between buying food or paying for medical care or medicine. So from these statistics, we see that food insecurity is more prevalent among different groups of people, that food insecurity is tied to health outcomes, and that many people are having to make significant trade-offs in their lives for necessities. So the term food desert refers to communities of high food insecurity that we generally attribute to the lack of healthful and affordable food. This is often a term people on the outside of a community use to label a community and is well-intentioned. However, some residents of these communities find the term food desert to be problematic. Deserts are naturally created, but the inequities we see today are man-made, stemming from systems of repression. Deserts are perceived as lifeless places, but there may be a lot of life and strength in these communities. And an often well-intentioned action when discovering a food desert is to advocate for a grocery store to move in. But that doesn't necessarily address the underlying issues that result in food insecurity, which we'll talk about more in this presentation. Food apartheid is a newer term that food justice advocates from these communities of high food insecurity have coined. Most of you have probably heard of apartheid, which means aparthood or apartness, and was a system of racial segregation that existed in South Africa from 1948 to the early 90s. Many residents feel a similar system of oppression in our food system, and by naming it as food apartheid, the real conversation can begin in addressing these underlying issues that lead to the inequities that we see today, rather than just addressing the surface level problems. To make this presentation, we interviewed multiple urban farmers and food justice advocates in St. Louis and the Metro East, including Kamina Lovelace, and one of her quotes was that you can't save food desert without understanding food apartheid. Food apartheid looks at the whole food system and considers income, race, and geography. It encompasses the social and racial inequalities that are at play in our food system. These are two maps of the greater St. Louis area, including the Metro East that Joey and I work in. The top map shows the percentage of Black residents per unit, with the darker green having the highest percentage. Most Black residents live in North St. Louis City, North St. Louis County, or in parts of the Metro East. This is the result of practices including redlining that Joey will talk about later. The map below shows areas of low income and low access, which you can see are also more concentrated in areas that Black residents live. So now we're going to look at the history as to why we see these disparities today. In speaking about racial justice following the killing of Michael Brown and the racial unrest that ensued in Ferguson, a local racial justice leader, Beatrice Beckford, stated, "The intricacy of America's systems of oppression have always used land and food as weapons of choice. This is something that we need to acknowledge. Our food system is built on stolen land, and to gain access to this land, settlers used food as a weapon. Many of the native people's livelihood was based around bison, so the colonists virtually wiped out their population. It is estimated that there were 30 to 60 million bison roaming the Great Plains pre-colonization, but only 300 by the end of the 18th century. This photo shows the settlers proudly displaying a mound of bison skulls. The decimation of bison signaled the end of the Indian Wars, and the people were pushed into reservations far from their traditional food sources. Essentially, the colonists were able to control these groups of people by cutting them off from their foodways. I start here because this demonstrates how the US has used food as power, as well as why. Food is essential to life, but it is also the basis of our cultures. The colonizers commodified and redistributed the land taken from the indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, Africans were enslaved to work the land. When slavery was abolished, though there was a promise to give formerly enslaved Africans 40 acres and a mule, this did not come to fruition. With few other opportunities, most formerly enslaved Africans became sharecroppers or farm workers. Some were able to acquire land, though generally marginal land not well suited to agriculture. Still, by 1890, approximately 14% of farmers were Black, owning 15 million acres of land, mostly in the South. However, today, only 1.5% of US farmers identify as Black, largely because of discriminatory lending and monetary support from the USDA and land theft. They also receive almost half in government subsidies compared to all farmers, and collectively own less than 1% of farmland. Other people of color, specifically those of Asian descent or Latinx, have been exploited for cheap farm labor and have faced similar discriminatory practices throughout history. Overall, Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color make up less than 4% of landowning farmers. Now that we have explored more about the unequal power related to the production of food, let's look at the other side of the systems in urban areas resulting in unfair access to these foods.
Awesome. Thank you, Grace. Really great information, and always impressed and always wanting to learn more as we get connected more when it comes to local food systems and small farms. So now, as Grace said, looking to more of the metropolitan areas, looking at another key concept or system that has led to many of our communities of low income or communities of colors experiencing food insecurity comes the term redlining. So some of you who may not have heard the term redlining. Redlining is a practice of outlining locations and neighborhoods in red seen as detrimental and awarding to mortgage lenders. See, in the past, due to the housing shortages in 1933, the federal government planned to increase Americans' housing stock under the New Deal through the New Housing Act of 1934. But while doing so, it also segregated housing and neighborhoods. So, talk about before when it comes to food apartheid, geography is very key. See, looking at the National Housing Act, it allowed for 30-year mortgages and low fixed interest rates. And they wanted to ensure that people wouldn't also default in the mortgages when providing them. And then came the Homeowner Loan Corporation, created to develop criteria and carry out provisions to allow safer investments. The government efforts were primarily designed to provide white lower middle class families opportunities to build their wealth with owning a house. So you see here in the picture in the left, it's a vacant row, houses lining a portion of Franklin Square, that formerly Redline neighborhood abandoned in Baltimore. As we said, reaching out to our community members, we have one of our food just advocates here, Jabari Conrad, when it comes to Bond Avenue Fish and Poultry. As he stated, the strategic removal of resources need to live, nothing natural with the food desert. Now let's look at some of these maps. The Homeowner Loan Corporation developed these residential security maps where they would map out neighborhoods into 4 different colored sections where redlining comes to. First, you have the green areas with businessmen, best area, and best people as they would classify. Section 2, when it comes to blue, would be white collar families, also known as good people to provide those mortgages. Comes to the third section, yellow, declining area, working class families. And then last is we talk now is redlining, red as seen as detrimental influences or hazardous. See, when it comes to neighborhoods with low class whites, they're seen as, when it comes to redlining, as neighborhoods with low class whites, foreign born people, Black Americans. They would often be seen in the criteria of those who be in the red line neighborhoods. Although studies didn't show that the people living in these red line neighborhoods would likely default on mortgage, they actually see rather not fit in the housing stock cover and what they wanted to see in the 1930s and so on as it progressed. The criteria maintainedly consistently put in redline communities the presence of Black or Brown communities as seen as hazardous or detrimental. You can see to the picture to the right, taken from the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab, outlining East St. Louis from past residential security maps, which still take into effect today when it comes to the challenges we see with food apartheid. This leads into the next phase when it comes to the systems or some of the concepts that led into some of the challenges. As you may have heard before, the white suburban flight. So as redlining progressed, the development of white suburban flight continued through the National Housing Act, the GI Bill, and the Homeowner Loan Corporation providing those back mortgages and preventing others from getting access based on the criteria. The development of suburbs started outside of the cities. Many white families had federal government support for the new neighborhoods, while rules criteria from the government acts were able to prevent Black and Brown communities to buy, refinance, or partake in the post-war economic boom. As we see as well, when it comes to the federal government subsidized the new development of these neighborhoods for these white families, highways and infrastructures were continually being built, as we see being positioned around, and the redlining communities and the residents were left behind. So I want to share with you this cycle that we see when it comes to redlining and white suburban flight. For the communities with limited resources, high crime, and food security as a part of food apartheid. See, starting with, we see the white suburban flight from the National Housing Act focused on development of white neighborhoods. People living in redline communities were unable to buy or refinance their homes, so eventually they become abandoned or left behind, not being able to partake in the housing stocks created by the Homeowner Loan Corporation. City services often then become unreliable as more properties get abandoned. We also see jobs availability decreases, limited jobs and opportunities led to crime. More crime and reliable city services cause property value to continue dropping, causing more to move out, and also less resources that are continue being pushed into these suburbs. But however, those who many can afford to migrate often get left behind with the issues festering inside. So we see these issues continue festering up for decades, leaving these redline communities in difficult situations, experiencing the high levels of food insecurity and crime, even though the Fair Act was passed in 1968 to prevent discrimination based on race, religion, origin, sex, family status, or disability. Much of the damage has been done in the past decades, and still continues to see the lack of enforcement when it comes to um, getting access to finance or getting mortgages or purchasing housing. So next, another system look at is when it comes to the food system of subsidized food commodities. Some of you may have already heard this term when it comes to subsidized food commodities. It's still important to put into play when it comes to how it affects our communities and getting access or getting food within that food apartheid. For those who haven't heard, there are food developed from federally funded crops to ensure the U.S. adequate supply of food. The strategy was to prevent food shortages and protect farmers from high-risk businesses when it comes to providing staple crops. Often we see them high in calories. They are versatile in the use when making, they're versatile in use more than making food, but when they are made into food, they are typically made into highly processed foods with poor nutritional value, as seen with soda, as with the high fructose corn syrup. These subsidized food commodities seem cheap due to the government subsidies, but have now become mass-produced and become more prevalent in vulnerable populations. Their addictive nature and high sugar and convenience increases the risk to heart diseases, chronic diseases like heart disease and type 2 diabetes, with communities already suffering from the lack of resources and infesting issues seen with redlining. So now we're starting to see this tangled web of food access, safety, and crime. So here, let's look at, kind of give you a visual. We see the tip of the iceberg of the issues being present in our communities when it comes to limited food access. But as I said before, there is this tangled web of food access, safety, and crime. Let's use the Metro East here in East St. Louis, for example, experiencing food apartheid. You see the subsidized food commodities often lack, and the lack of quality foods in the corner stores filling the void of those left behind, or when it comes to the communities with lacking food access to grocery stores. Then many of these corner stores create negative messaging with the promotion of alcohol and other unhealthy foods, at times just getting revenue for just posting a banner advertising those products. We start seeing more of the saturation of liquor stores developing. We also see alcoholism starts to increase, but it continues to also damage and endanger those around the community. As we've seen with the illegal activity that occur when it comes to the crime happening around these corner stores, also SNAP and WIC fraud due to lack of surveillance. We also see the selling of underage tobacco and alcohol access to minors. And this will give you a better picture going into the next map. And we do want to acknowledge when it comes to the local efforts of Make Help Happen Coalition in East St. Louis for their mission in working to improve access and creating healthier spaces in East St. Louis. And getting assistance with a lawyer providing pro bono, they're able to create this map and a heat map, what I share right after, to portray the challenges East St. Louis faces when it comes to these food apartheid. Here you can see all the bars and liquor license SNAP vendors within East St. Louis and the very limited grocery stores. For many of those living in public housing spaces, they are only 0.4 miles away to a liquor store. Additionally, when you have the average distance to a grocery store for public housing is about 3 miles. As you look into another map, you'll see how the distance to liquor stores or these corner stores can be more alarming when it comes to the access to resources. We see here's a heat map of liquor licensed corner stores with shots fired within the 2-year span of 2015-2017, with more higher rates occurring near these liquor stores from as high as 79 to 165 shots fired. It's important to acknowledge these challenges we see as if healthy foods are being brought in can be a challenge for families to access them or even feel safe in getting the local foods in if those policies aren't looked into when it comes to providing more surveillance and support. So we see these saturated corner stores and liquor stores, limited resources and surveillance from being redlined and lack of access and opportunities have put our communities living in these food insecure locations in unsafe situations, including the alcohol further exacerbating the situation to homicides, suicides, intimate partner violence, child maltreatment, so on and so forth, as you see these icons on the slide. And as I said before, you see the banners being posted, continue providing negative messaging, increasing the alcohol that's further exacerbating the challenges. So going back to the systems in place when it comes to perpetuating food apartheid, as I said before, picture this iceberg. You see food insecurity and hunger present as this is being labeled as a problem of food desert. But food apartheid helps show the whole picture, and under the iceberg are the underlying factors with the systems in place perpetuating healthy food access. We see with the system of housing segregation and historical racism, with redlining leaving communities with limited opportunities, resources, and infrastructure. This also includes discrimination to those accessing agricultural subsidies when it comes to farming. Going to the federal agricultural subsidies that help finance the production of corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice, when used for food, they often become converted into refined grains, which are high fat and high sodium processed foods or sugary beverages. Eating many of these foods can lead to dietary illnesses like type 2 diabetes and heart disease due to this nature of its nutritional value. Many of these foods often get promoted and are the only food accessible in these lower income communities or communities of color. We also see the social inequalities between neighborhoods and schools where families are residing, which we share example how we see the SNAP vendors, food pantries, and churches providing food in these communities seen in East St. Louis, but they still continue to suffer the high crime and homicide due to the limited resources and opportunities needed to survive and make ends meet. We also see how affluent neighborhoods having better infrastructure and access to social resources compared to those in our lower income communities, as we talked about before with the white flight to suburban communities and redlining. There's also saturation of corner stores and liquor stores, as I said before, filling that void when it comes to further exacerbating the health and safety. And the saturation in the communities providing more venues to sell and promote alcohol with limited oversight, perpetuating violence and crime. Now we see the tip of the iceberg, as I said before, with food insecurity, which would take more than bringing a grocery store or food pantry, which only helps treat a system of food apartheid, but literally looking at those systems and working with the local partners, which we'll talk about next. So key concepts. As we said before, we're going to divide some of these terms. So let's look at some of these terms here on this slide. It's important to note these terms. For one, food justice, communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. Healthy food is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and grown locally with the care and well-being of land workers and animals. The goal is getting the food justice piece in working within our food apartheid communities. Then we have food sovereignty. It is the right of the people to access healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. I know we all get eager, and I do myself when it comes to jumping in trying to help, but it's very important to acknowledge the history as we're talking about today, doing proper research, and building those relationships that help meet the needs of meet the needs of food and rights, and not ours when it coming from the outside. As I said before, these two concepts are essential moving forward in talking about food apartheid and food insecurity. So we're presenting all these problems, and some of you may be asking, what do I do now? Well, fortunately, you all are doing the great step right now in attending this webinar. So thank you for being here. Food apartheid can be complicated. The inequities we see from hundreds of years of systems stemming from white supremacy, it's really hard to know what to do. We've put together a few suggestions based on our research and interviews with the residents in communities struggling with food apartheid. The first is to allow the residents to define the problem. In our experience, most people prefer the term food apartheid over food desert. They feel it's more appropriate, as well as stimulate the mindful use of our language and not making assumptions. Rather than pointing out what is wrong with the community, focus on assets, what it has to offer. If you have identified a community you would like to help, find out more who are already working that issue within that community, as I shared before with Make Health Happens efforts in East St. Louis. They make some time. This may take some time, but there's good chance there's already someone who grows food or wants to or is selling produce at their small corner store and is concerned about these kind of issues too. For us personally, we see our instinct is to swoop in and find a solution for a community with high food insecurity. But I realize this can be that saber complex mentality. And when it's actually more important to find and support others doing the work, in a similar vein, instead of just think about access to food, think about access to the decision-making table. So who's making decisions for these communities? Oftentimes, it's not representative of the communities of the people facing the issue. Think about how you can get residents to the places where they can voice on land use, zoning, if liquor stores or dollar stores can move in. They may be obstacles in getting these meetings, such as time of inadequate advertising, day, location, or even childcare. When working with the community, be aware of its history. They also may be a history of outsiders coming in, extracting research, and starting up projects and then leaving without any word back to the communities they did support for, or they say what they would support. This may lead to distrust that you have to overcome. If you don't plan to get involved with a specific community, you can still help by talking about food apartheid and related issues to politicians and other decision makers. Overall, the goal should be food sovereignty communities being able to define and take part in the food system they want. We also just want to acknowledge a special thanks to those who helped make this possible. As we see here, it comes to Tyrone Lewis. You can find more information about him on Instagram at Haru Urban Farming or at their website at haruurbanfarming.com. Tasha Phoenix, find more information at Food Equity Advisory Board. Comenia Lovelace at Instagram and Garden Devon. Jabari Carvet at Fish and Bond at Bond Avenue Fish and Poultry. You can find them at Bond Avenue Fish. Marley Goodwin, you can find more information about them in Jeremiah's Food Pantry on Facebook. And also another special shout out to our program coordinators in SNAP-Ed here in Unit 22 and helping bring this topic to us and bring this presentation to fruition as we're providing to you all today. These are our sources we want to provide, see all the information was gathered. And lastly, again, we want to say a special thank you to you all for attending this, as you're all taking the right steps forward when it comes to tackling these issues of food insecurity and helping change that dialogue when it comes to food desert or food apartheid. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Joey, Grace and Joey, for your presentation. Right now, if anyone has some questions, put them in the chat box. We'd like to hear more from you. If you have anything answered. Joey and Grace, with food apartheid, as an individual coming into an area, how would one get involved? How would a small farmer get involved with possibly finding an outlet for their produce in an urban market, in an urban area, an inner city market? Lots of farmers just don't have an idea quite how to do that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, it's going to vary from region to region, I'm sure. I mean, I feel like coming into the Metro East or St. Louis area, there are some organizations that are already here that could help with defining, you know, where areas of need are, where there are outlets of food that that you could bring your food into. And then, yeah, like there are some small corner stores, like Joey's been working with Jabari Conrad, who's in East St. Louis, and they're selling a lot of fresh produce and are actually, I think, looking for more like local produce to sell there. So again, like that is something that it just takes time to network and find who the people are in that community that will make your project the most successful and effective.
Yeah, and kind of just to add on when it comes to Grace's point, really looking at that asset mapping and doing that research and taking time. Sometimes you might get lucky and you might find that one individual, but continue asking around and work with those around you. I know when it comes to our side with SNAP-Ed, working with the food pantries can be a good place to start. But even so, looking at when it comes to the residents around there, local town halls or coalitions, and doing that research in there can help provide that venue and asking those questions. So at the time, it may be a little daunting, but the outcomes are really worth it because you'll definitely find those in the partners who are really doing the action stuff instead of reinventing the wheel and might potentially step on someone's toe. Knowing those all around her are being part of that conversation and also trying to learn more and when you want to get in that conversation of providing those local foods.
Another question for both of you. You mentioned allowing residents to define the problem. Could you also allow the residents to define the solution? Would this help empower the local residents if they can assist with the solution? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. But I mean, it's best if it's a community-driven solution.
Yeah. And
Okay.
something you can as well look into is having those stakeholders right in those conversations. With some of the coalitions we have is having one of those residents be when the board members are being brought into the conversation, because many times it can be difficult due to time or having childcare, but having a representative talking within about the communities they live in and reside. Say, for example, East St. Louis, we have a local resident and parent who's also a teacher in East St. Louis who attends our board meetings and also provide us more intel and thoughts of what's happening within our communities, provide that information, and also just sharing the opportunity when we do have those meetings and putting it in venues where they can see or even recording it for them. They want to get involved and share more information.
Oh, thank you. Are either of you aware of any legislation, whether it's state or federal or both, addressing food insecurity that we who are interested in this matter should pay attention to? And
I know, at least on our side, some of the local efforts we're looking into is providing this good neighbor policy within East St. Louis. Because some of the challenge we do see is that surveillance, right? Or how close some of the zoning is when it comes to these corner stores that are do selling alcohol being next to public housing. So looking at some of the laws and legislation that comes to the zoning and better surveillance of our communities is something to look out to. I know SNAP and PBT is looking to extend. So really taking a look at that as well, or the PBT can be good information and providing more of those resources to look into. But yes, within local efforts, that good neighbor policy kind of I mentioned and looking in the surveillance map. And when it comes to the new pandemic, when it came to the stimulus package that was sent out to, really paying attention as those resources being provided into those communities who need that support or helping out those local businesses in the communities.
Here is a question that goes back to the beginning, talking about the issue of how Black farmers have been removed off the land over the past 150 years. This question asks, how would that there are some farmers, they're upset about monies allocated to the Black farmers in the recent COVID relief bill. How could one use the information in this presentation to explain to those who don't understand why that money was set aside? Any thoughts?
I mean, my main thoughts would just be to, talk about that history and making sure that, I mean, I don't think that people are really aware, like I wasn't even aware until like the last year or two, the issues around land use for Black farmers and other farmers of color, and just seeing how, there's documented evidence to show that like the USDA had discriminatory lending practices and subsidy and monetary support that are things that you can look at. I don't have specific information about, the past COVID relief bills and, exactly what that money went to. I would just say that it would be good to explore the history and then, think about how this is filling that gap and how it's helping debt relief for a lot of farmers that have been suffering.
Very good. And I would echo what you said, Grace. Having spent the past year looking into this and doing some education, it was rather eye-opening for me as a former white farmer to see how these practices were used. So
Hey,
now
Doug,
another question.
Can I jump in here really quick?
Sure.
For a comment on that, and there was actually a question that was asked to me privately, and I wanted to ask. It was actually the first question. So let me. So I do know, to answer that question, part of that question in terms of at the federal level, I think the gears have been slow when it comes to the USDA responding to this, in particular with the farmers of color, BIPOC. But I do know that at the local and state level, that in different states there has been some response to this. I do know that there was some grant funding available from the Illinois Department of Commerce specifically for BIPOC communities related to agriculture at the state level. So there are some conversations happening at different levels of government. But why the federal government response is so slow, I mean, that's that's more of a challenging one to answer. There was a question earlier on that got asked me directly about food deserts in small rural areas and the sort of overlap and correlation with, I guess, that term food apartheid as it relates to, communities in rural areas in particular. Does that term apply for food insecure communities in rural areas? And any comments about that?
Yeah, at least on my side, because I actually recently used to live in a rural community back in 2018 to 2020 up in Fulton County. Something that we saw a lot, very prevalent, is the popping up of all these Dollar Generals or even Casey's. I'm pretty sure if anyone who drives through Illinois will always see a Casey's. And that can be a great point too, is the challenges of what food is being provided when it is present and how that can lead to more issues of, are they providing the local access to those food, or are they providing healthy food choices in those different Dollar Generals or in those Caseyville or those Casey's? And the challenge is trying to, as they mentioned here too, is going to be many miles in different locations and then transportation. And that's a system too, as we see, as more people are leaving into the communities or to the urban areas, they're also leaving behind those in the rural communities who want to stay there, but who might not have the finance to, and it can leave them being challenged when it comes to access to transportation. So it's very much a system in place as well that's perpetuating when it comes to access to foods in our rural communities as well.
But I would also
go ahead.
Sorry. I'd also go kind of back to our suggestion of just letting the residents define the issue. If it doesn't, if it doesn't resonate with the residents there to call it food apartheid, then it doesn't need to be called food apartheid. And if they like food deserts, then I mean, I have no exact issue. And in some communities, and like with some people that are familiar with the term food apartheid, I do say like this, like communities of food apartheid versus like communities of low food access. But I do also use that kind of terminology too, that may not be as like divisive, or just like that people may not everyone is familiar obviously with food apartheid. It's a pretty new term. And so yeah, I would say just letting the residents define what they want to be labeled as, and working on issues like that, but also thinking about this bigger picture. So even if they aren't wanting to name their community as a food apartheid community, thinking about this whole systems approach, which is more important than just the term that you put to it.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Now I'm going to ask you to explain some of the acronyms we've been using, and both of you were using. What does SNAP stand for? I use that. And I never explained that.
No, and I do apologize. It's a force of habit. SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Many before people have heard of it as when it comes to food stamps, but it is here when it comes to Illinois, the Link EBT cards. Provided when it comes to those who qualify can use, or they'll get essentially like a debit card that can be purchased in SNAP retail or SNAP vendors. They could be in grocery stores or sometimes even corner stores as well. But yes, it's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
Are you seeing the use of EBT cards at farmers markets or where local produce is sold?
Yes, and that's actually, I'm really glad you point that out, because that's something that's a system or a policy or environmental change that we talked about, is working with local local farmer markets and getting them to be able to apply for or even accept SNAP EBT, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that those funds so they can purchase healthier food resources. And the nice thing, a lot of times too, you might be able to connect with farmers markets and double those bucks when it comes to utilizing that SNAP EBT in those farmers markets. And some of the things, that's what we do here in our SNAP Ed side, is kind of partnering with our farmers markets and getting them connected and being a SNAP vendor.
Thank you. What do each of you see as some of the key vulnerabilities, this is a question, of urban agriculture land plots and organizations pertaining particularly to distressed low-income people of color areas? That's the question.
So Doug, can I ask you to repeat that? I didn't get the first part.
Yes. What are some of the key vulnerabilities of urban agriculture land plots, I would say gardens, farming areas, and organizations pertaining to these distressed low-income areas that people live in?
I would say that one thing in the greater St. Louis area that they've actually been able to make some movement on is that, like, a lot of people would want to set up urban farming on plots of land that they would lease out, but you know, since you didn't have really full ownership of that, you couldn't really make the investments in the soil that were worthwhile, knowing that, you know, someone may say that you can't own, like, that you can't farm on that property in the future. And so they've actually been able to make some movement on that with the Missouri Coalition for the Environment, which doesn't just do work in, like, or doesn't do work just in Missouri, but also a little bit on the east side too, so in Illinois. But I know that's something that they've been working on, as well as zoning. I know here actually there was an issue that came up because some white farmers came in and they had a composting facility in North St. Louis, which, like, the land there was cheap, and a lot of the neighbors actually didn't like it. They didn't like the smells of the composting facility. And so that actually got, I don't know, kind of a little bit of heat and controversy. And I think that farm is now moving their composting operation a little bit more rurally, but kind of also just being mindful of the residents around that area and what they want to see that land being used as. I don't know if that exactly went with the question, but it made me think of that. But yeah, so, like, a vulnerability would just definitely be, you know, access to land that you actually own, and zoning.
Okay, very good. I also noticed that someone said there's a new appropriations bill on the table entitled Support Healthy Food Access at Farmers Markets while keeping SNAP dollars local. It's House Bill 2520, Representative Butler. I didn't know anything about that, but that's something out there. Another question, have you seen newer, few years old now, SNAP retail requirement on required products impacting the corner store carrying more diversified products? Whoa, that's quite a question. Have you seen?
lot to pack in.
Yeah. In other words, have you seen some of the new SNAP retailer requirements having an impact on the products being carried at those stores?
So when it comes to the retail requirements, not that I'm aware of, but I can definitely look more into with their statewide team about that. when it comes to the requirements. But one things I did see impacting some of the corner stores is when it comes to the surveillance of what qualifies when it comes to utilizing those SNAP EBT cards, as we call in the past food stamps. But when utilizing SNAP, as I said before, SNAP or WIC fraud, because typically it's supposed to be these, we have a list of requirements when it comes to the foods being provided that are saying that this is what you can buy with SNAP. Typically it has to be cold food items or fresh produce. It cannot be hot items. But the challenges sometimes is you might have competitions between corner stores who said, this corner store allowed me to buy hot foods with my SNAP EBT. Why won't you let me? So there's a business or there's that competition going on, causing a lot of these different corner stores, and at least within the areas we're focusing in the Metro East, to do SNAP or WIC fraud, as I said. And WIC is the women and infants and children when it comes to getting those as well, those food access or getting food. These typically belong with SNAP. But we see that there is that fraud going on where they're providing people with these hot foods, but charging it in their SNAP EBT card as one of the food items that's been approved. So that's been a challenge of sometimes even corner stores losing their SNAP vendor license or losing their ability to provide SNAP EBT. So that's the challenge that we're seeing on our side when it comes to corner stores of enforcement of actually utilizing SNAP to its true benefit and not providing those unhealthy food items that we're trying to prevent.
Okay. Another question, and there's a lot of discussion on this nationally. Would changes with providing a living wage, how would that be helpful in helping to address our food access issues we have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a living wage gets at some of those underlying issues that result in food insecurity and is probably a more, I don't know if broad is the right word, but like really getting at more of the issues than just increasing like a farmer's market in a food desert area, which is, I mean, it's lovely, it's well-intentioned, but I do think that guaranteeing that everyone has a living wage would be even more helpful.
Yeah, and it helps just add on with Grace, that equity piece too, is we're trying to get everyone the needs that comes to those challenges. And the idea when it comes to a lot of the federal nutrition programs, these food pantries, to help those who are vulnerable. And we want to get them to the place where they can sustain themselves and don't always want to continue to create this system dependency. We want to create sustainable changes. So having that true living wage can be a part of creating those policy changes, and then working with all those local in the community, providing these job opportunities as well. So I mean, personally, yes, I do like the idea of having truly living wage to help when it comes to mitigating those challenges we see with food insecurity.
Okay. Another person has a question. Do either of you know of any contemporary models of food systems that could be adopted or adapted to help mitigate the problem of food insecurity in these communities?
I don't know of a specific model. If people in the audience have a model they're working on, like feel free to put that in the chat. But I would also say that, I mean, food, like different communities have different issues, and I think that just making them being able to create that model is going to be more powerful than me telling you what a good model is out there and then applying it to all of these different communities, because they're all different, and the residents should really be driving that.
Yes. So look for examples in your area. Now, if they reached out, if this person wanted to reach out to either of you for possible examples of some that are working in the Metro East area, would that be all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure. That would be great.
Okay. There we go.
Some great questions and discussions happening in the chat. So I'm trying to catch up with like, all right, am I missing any?
That's right. So where do you see the role of food pantries in the issue of food insecurity?
Yes, and really great question. Thank you. I personally love working with food pantries. It's always been my passion. So a lot of times when it comes to SNAP or even WIC or some of these federal nutrition programs, there is gaps that happen. Sometimes those who making a certain wage might not qualify to get SNAP. So that's where a lot of food pantries come into play in helping meet those gaps. And even those who might be receiving federal nutrition support when it comes to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, but they might still have challenges when it comes to meeting all the food needs depending on their household size and their specific demands. So the food pantry helps continue providing that bridge when it comes to that food access. And something that I love about food pantries too is a way, and not saying that it's a model that it's contemporary that we can, it's finalized, but really helping the food pantries also provide that opportunity working with local small farms or even working with different community gardens and getting some of those and providing into the food pantries to provide back into the communities who need that nutrition support. And food pantries have been very dynamic, especially during these challenges with the pandemic and meeting those needs. And some things we do too is a lot of people may feel uncomfortable going into a food pantry due to stigma or due to the fact that they don't feel it's necessary. So we try to create a system with food pantries called client choice. The idea is to get get individuals to come into the food pantries and create a shopping style model where they choose their foods instead of bringing a pre-packaged or pre-bagged food. So they'll go in, choose based on the needs. This helps to reduce overhead costs, as well as it helps to increase when it comes to meeting those dietary needs, because as we said before, we see a lot of families who do go to these food pantries typically have underlying health conditions. So helping them feel less stigmatized going to them, making them feel comfortable, and then bringing back and giving that choice, because men, those who may be utilizing the food system don't really have much options in their lives. But giving that choice and giving that dignity back, which you try to push, food pantries help bring that and get people back on their feet and providing and helping them with the food system.
Okay, boy,
So there's a lot in that one.
Yeah. Well, no, that's good. The chat just keeps moving. I can't hardly keep up with it, which is good.
One thing I wanted to add to that, the conversation around food pantries, Doug, is a couple years ago, I was at a conference where there were some representatives from Feeding America, which is the large U.S. nonprofit organization with the food bank network. And they actually there are some incentives within that program at the national regional level for farmers to sell produce into that food bank and pantry system. It's not, it's not obviously it's at market levels, but they're encouraging farmers who have produce that might otherwise get composted or thrown out to actually, bring that produce to some of those feed banks, and there is some monetary incentive for them to do so. I thought that was interesting. I don't know that much about the program, but I do know that it is through Feeding America in particular. So I just want to throw that out there.
Okay, and I have someone who is asking if you know of whether there have been any farmers to family food boxes during the pandemic in Metro East area, and if they contained dairy and produce in those boxes.
Yeah, I know that the East St. Louis School District was giving out some of those boxes. And I mean, I didn't go over to check to make sure that they had milk and produce, but I mean, I think that's what was detailed in the program. So.
Yeah, and they often, just to add to Grace's point, they often shift when it comes to what's provided. So sometimes it might be a dairy box, sometimes it may be more produce, and even other times they do provide meat or protein. And some of the things we do as well is when it comes to those food boxes, we have a Metro East Food Pantry Coalition who shares that information to different food pantries to collect them and bring them into their food pantries. And then they unpackage them if they have different cooling systems and put it back into their storage. So when clients come in, they can have that pantry choice. We talk about client choice, because I know many times it might be boxed already. And some of those families may just want all of that. But other times there might be certain food items in those boxes that they might not want and they might throw away. And we're trying to avoid that food waste. So the food pantries have been able to work together in getting those food boxes and putting into their storage units, depending on what storage they have, and they're giving it back to the communities. But yes, they also do see dairy, as Grace pointed out, into those different food boxes.
Yes, and I would point out that here in Decatur, our food pantries have moved to the choice model from the package box model of years past. So yes, your team is making headway.
Oh, good.
Your team is making headway. Grace, do you have any advice to anyone who might be thinking about gardening in an urban area?
Yeah. I mean, my first advice is just to get your soil tested or to buy like containerized production systems. I guess I'm not sure if the food production is for themselves or that they are planning on like selling any of this. Kind of, yeah, that would depend on the answer, but I mean, I would say go for it. It's a great idea for you, for sure, and helping with your neighborhood, if not for a larger community.
Yeah, very good. Yes, thank you. And I want to once again point out that Zach has put in the QR codes there on the screen for the survey, and he has also put a link into the chat box. Our last question, what is the role, do you see a role for faith-based gardening and food distribution with dealing with the food insecurity issue?
So actually, like in the Metro East, I would say that's like one of the assets is just like the Black churches in this area are really strong and connected with people. And I mean, there's the Black Food Security Network, I think it's called, that works on this issue on a broader scale, not just in our area. But I think that it's a very powerful way of having the people that are in this, are residents of these communities, producing and being part of the food system. So I think that for sure that's, depending on your area, I think that's a really great option.
Okay, yes. We're even seeing it here in rural areas, that model being adopted as well. So I want to thank Grace and Joey for sharing their insights on these food system topics. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. And hopefully this presentation has given you some new ideas you can put in place yet this winter and for the upcoming spring season. And if you haven't taken time now, one more time, fill out the evaluation, links in the chat box and the codes on the screen, and also look for an email once again coming from us with a link to the archived webinar on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel and a link to a second chance to complete the evaluation of this webinar you have just watched. With that, have a great day, stay dry, and see you next week. Bye-bye.